Welcome to the Youth Work Plus podcast.
This is where we chat about all things youth and kids work. I'm Olly Short.
And I'm Becky Lawrence. Both of us have been involved in paid and volunteer youth and kids work at churches and charities for over about 15 years. We know a little bit about the highs and lows of ministry, the great moments, the tricky bits. We know it can be tough, demanding, thankless and isolating, as well as rewarding, joy-filled, fun, fulfilling and everything in between. It's for anyone who does any sort of kids or youth ministry, either as a worker or a volunteer, or anybody interested in it. We would love you to join us as we share our experience of kids and youth work, the challenges, the things we've learned along the way, as well as hopefully during this new series, interviewing some other guests who are involved in youth and kids work as well. And we hope there might be at least some bits that will equip and support you in your ministry, or at the very least that you'll be entertained with stories of our own kids and youth work successes and fails.
We've had a bit of a break from podcast recording. We were doing them every month. And probably a big part of the break is Becky had a child, which is very exciting. And why we've been so long coming back is because I'm actually training to be a vicar at Wycliffe. We're in Wycliffe right now. We're in my study room, and my fellow study mates have been very kind and letting me use the study room to record this because it's less noisy than my lounge. But actually, one of the things that kicked us off coming back was we've had a question from a guy called David asking about doing youth work or youth ministry if you don't have a building. I think, was the question specific about having no building at all or just not having church building?
I think it was about not having a church building, but it kind of hinted at the fact that they haven't got a building of their own, I think. So do you want to start off, Ollie, or shall I start off or with answering the question?
Yeah, I'll start. So our youth work context back when I was all those months ago when I was doing youth work, we started without you. We had church buildings, so we had a church and we had a church hall, but we actually started a good amount of our youth work not using those church buildings out of choice. Some of the downside of church buildings is they can be pretty big, and they're usually designed for a kind of lecture style setup, with a stage and chairs and stuff like that. And that wasn't the vibe we were going for with our youth ministry. We wanted it to feel much more kind of community based than that, much more discussion based. So we actually set up small little youth groups. I've probably told the story about the first we called them cell groups, which was probably not very good on reflection, but that is what they were called and the name stuck. But the first one of those that I was around for setting up, we did in the vicar's house, actually, in the vicarage. So I guess that is kind of a church building. And we just met in his living room. And I think a big plus side of being in a home is it feels much more real, a bit less corporate, and a bit less, you have to do this because you're a church, and more we're choosing to welcome you into our lives. And the best, probably the best groups and the ones where I had the best relationships built were the ones that met in homes, either in my house or in other people who went to our church who really supported the youth work. They very kindly opened up their homes and let some young people loose in them. And that is a sacrifice. It does come at cost. As careful as young people try and be, I mean, it depends on your young people. Our young people were very respectful, but stuff got broken. People had mistakes. Me and my wife had just moved into our first flat, and we're really excited and super house proud. We've since had children and are no longer house proud. But we had a cream carpet, and one of the young people just knocked a load of Fanta over. It stuck on a chair and was just glugging bright orange Fanta onto our lovely new carpet. Yeah, it was nothing on purpose, but I was sad about that. They slowly smashed their way through all our glassware to the point where we only gave them plastic cups. And all of these guys are like in their 20s now. And when they come around to our house, as a joke, we still give them plastic cups and pretend we don't trust them. Yeah, so that's one area of our youth ministry. We did also do big active games and stuff, which was tailored around a big hall space. But probably the most productive and the most ministry discipleship growing work was done in people's homes for us, and they were really great venues. But it relies on people being willing to make that sacrifice of having, 4 or 5 young people who are clumsy and loud and occasionally break things.
Yeah. I guess to like strip the question right back, like so that it's a bit relatable for everybody, because I guess everybody will be at in different contexts, won't they? So some people will have a church building, some people will have a church building, but it won't be very suitable for hosting kids or youth work. Some people might have, purpose-built spaces that are just for youth and kids stuff, or purpose-built rooms within their church for that stuff. And I guess there's pros and cons of all of it, isn't there? Sometimes when you haven't got your own building, you have to be a bit more creative in terms of where you meet, like in homes that you've mentioned, Olly. Also making most of public spaces. So like obviously in the summer, doing a lot of things outside. The church that I do kids and youth work at, we haven't got our own building, and we're a church plant. And so we've had to think outside the box for quite a long time in terms of how we do kids and youth stuff. And we do utilize outdoor spaces a lot, especially like in the midst of COVID and off the back of COVID, because the outdoors seemed like a safe space for people to come and be involved in, not to kind of put anybody off. So yeah, we've used outside a lot, and brought chairs to the park and kind of sat around in a circle. We've done all sorts of things, as well as doing more kind of social stuff where we can use, coffee shops, bowling alleys, any space, dessert restaurants, all sorts of spaces where young people might like to go anyway, that we can sort of tick off. So it helps you to think through like what you do with the time that you're in those places as well, because you don't want to be delivering, like a whole 30-minute talk with, like a service type thing. It's much more, it forces you to be a lot more relational in what you do with a group of young people. If you are using, a home or a living room or a coffee shop, it makes it a lot more conversational. So you can still lead it. And there's, loads of creativity you can have within that in terms of what you do. And you can even still use multimedia stuff, like you can watch something on a laptop or give people the link to watch it on their phones or whatever. And you can have printed stuff on paper, or you can just make the whole thing conversational, which is what we've tended to do a lot more. And I think it can, when you're forced to think outside the box, actually, sometimes you're much more creative. And so that has kind of been my experience with doing youth and kids work without a building.
I was going to say it can be quite hard, especially like getting going without a building, because I think a lot of our traditional models of youth work we've built around the traditional spaces that we have. So I think it can take like an extra step, or our church wasn't a church plant, but where we've been in kind of shared spaces or spaces that aren't exclusively for the use of the youth, it's more tidying up. You've got it, it's not set up for the youth, so therefore an extra onus is on you as the leaders, or you pass that out to the young people and they help set up and help clear up and stuff. But it does add extra layers. But I do, like you were saying, Becky, I think it's really worth it because it encourages creativity. We're no longer tied by the space that we have, it frees us up a little bit more, depending on what's available,
Yeah.
to think and shape our youth work around the young people we've got and this weird creative space that we may or may not have. And you mentioned like spaces like bowling alleys and stuff like that. I think it can be really helpful if you've got local places or places where young people go anyway. So ours is a village context, and there's a really great cafe owner, and he used to let us do all our Sunday morning work in the cafe, which was cool because young people would go to that cafe anyway. So
Yeah.
it's a bit less of a, it kind of brings the sacred and secular together, which is good. But you need I think you kind of, it's helpful if you're in those spaces to get the okay of the people. Otherwise, it adds an extra layer of stress. That's been my experience anyway, where we just rocked up and the people
Yeah.
working didn't know we were coming. Um, it puts everyone on edge. Whereas if you know,
Yeah.
or you can do a deal with your local coffee shop or your bowling alley and say, just ring in advance and be cheeky and ask the question. And if
Yeah.
they say no, then it rules it out as a place and you're not, yeah.
Yeah. At a previous church plant I was involved in, we actually rented, well, we kind of borrowed space from another church as well, because
Mm.
the stuff we ran was not on a Sunday morning or when they would be using their building. So we kind of asked to use, it was like using their side hall. And then there was also a coffee shops like on the main high street, another independent one that wasn't open on, I think it was like a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon. They were only open Saturday and Sunday morning. So they used to let us use the coffee shop like out of hours kind of thing, and put a sign in the window saying private function type thing. So it was just sort of our space. So you can be creative. Like it doesn't have to be a public space with the public there either. Like
Mm.
sometimes you can be a bit creative with like choosing a space where there isn't going to be a lot of other people around, or like renting or borrowing a space. And sometimes like we can think, oh, actually, they're not going to let us use it, or, it's a big ask, or we can be a bit British about it and like feel bad about asking for something. Whereas I think sometimes if we can get over that first ask, then actually it ends up being like a happy ending in the end, because like they're happy to let us use it. It ends up being like fulfilling or solving one of our problems in terms of space, and somewhere to
Yeah.
be.
And I think sometimes we can be a bit Puritan about it shouldn't matter what the space is like. But if you're starting from scratch, um, it's worth looking and being like, where's nice,
Yeah.
and not having, because that maybe seems a bit materialistic, but it shows a welcome and a love and a care to the young people if it's somewhere that's nice and is actually
Yeah.
a nice place to be. And again, that's an advantage because some of our church buildings aren't all that nice. Depends. If you're in a lovely kind of old C of E, not pretty church, that can be quite a nice space, but maybe not fit for purpose. But some of the old like 1950s halls and stuff that we meet in, you wouldn't go there for any other reason. They're ugly and they
Mm.
smell like,
Yeah.
but if you somewhere that actually feels nice.
When I was a young person, part of a youth group, we used an old chapel as our kind of, so it wasn't the church that the church was meeting in, it was like an old dilapidated chapel. And like you sat down on like a crusty sofa, and like about 10 mice ran out from underneath it. And like it was just like the not the coziest, it was freezing cold. It had those like ceiling heaters where like if you were standing or sitting directly underneath it, the top of your head was getting burnt, but the rest of you was like freezing.
Yeah, our church hall had those. We're really blessed to have the church hall, but those
Yeah.
overhead heaters were awful.
Yeah.
They made more noise than they did heat.
But then like thinking back to those days and times that I spent there, like it wasn't a nice place to be, but we kept on going back every week.
Yeah,
So like sometimes we think, the venue is really, really important, which I think it can be. But then, if you're providing something that young people really can engage with, then it doesn't really matter on the venue because they're going to keep coming back anyway.
yeah. I think it's more about what you communicate through all of the stuff. It's what you're communicating to the young people. Do you value their time? Do you value them? Do you value the message that you're that you're giving to them and the faith that you're
Yeah.
encouraging them to engage with. And if you can do that, you can do that in any building. It's just about having an awareness. And if you can
Yeah.
do that in a kind of musty church hall with overhead heaters, you can do it anywhere.
Yeah.
My
I
wife
think
used to be able to smell when I'd been in our church hall. And my daughter goes there for kids work now, which she loves, but she smells like Friday nights to me because I spent so many Friday
uh,
nights in that church hall.
yeah. I was just going to say, like a lot of churches use schools, don't they? As like their building, which sometimes can be great because I don't know if it's a primary school and you're doing kids work in a classroom, like you've got chairs and tables that are the right size and like it kind of works. Um, but I think sometimes it can then feel very schooly what you end up doing with them.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to think through a bit more carefully kind of what the content is so that it is different to being at school and it doesn't just feel like not very interactive, one-sided, we're going to teach you this kind of thing. It has to be, we have to make things fun and we have to make them engaging and we have to make them interactive, I think. And sometimes our venue sometimes limits our creativity with those kind of things. Children's centres can be like a game-changing venue for churches to use on the weekend because obviously they're not open Saturday, Sunday. And we've used it before for our church for stuff. And like obviously they've got purpose-built rooms for small kids. So sometimes they can be really, really good places. And sometimes they'll let you use it for not a lot of money or even for free if you've got a good relationship with them. So it's worth kind of tapping into those for family work or kids work. Yeah, sometimes the limits on venue make us think outside the box in terms of what we provide, not just like thinking of a youth group. Sometimes we think it can cause us to think like, well, can I use a coffee shop to meet, 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 with a couple of young people and get to know them that way and do some mentoring stuff, as well as thinking through like, well, I've got to do a youth group. I think sometimes when we like given a room or a space, like we automatically think through what we can do with it. Whereas when we come at it from the other end of, well, what do we want to run and what do we
Yeah.
need to run it?
And
Like,
then what space will be helpful
yeah,
to do that?
exactly. Yeah, it kind of comes from a totally different
That's
angle.
that's the ideal way round.
Yeah.
Often we've all got places that, there are options, but I think if we can do it from that way around,
We probably
you
all
end up
should
with
start
better.
by thinking, what is it that we want to run?
Yeah. Rather than, but it really does shape what you do. So
Yeah.
we had those house-based groups running for years and years. And then during COVID, after COVID, you were allowed to meet together, but you weren't allowed in people's houses.
Yeah.
And actually, I wanted to condense a lot of the groups down to try and make it more efficient. And we all started meeting in the church. So we brought all the groups together essentially and went much more for a kind of traditional style of we started all together, we did big games together, and then we divided off for discussion. And the building itself shaped what was happening with the youth work, even though we were quite intentional about not doing that. And we wanted to protect the character of the youth work. It really did, like slowly it made a difference. It made an impact on. So it is worth, I think, starting if you can, starting from what do we want to do, and is the building we have fit for purpose. So even if you do have a building and it's not, it doesn't work for what you're trying to do with the youth work. If you're trying to run a kind of edgy feeling cool, you've seen youthscapes drop in and you want to kind of emulate it, but you've got an old Methodist chapel that's been converted into a hall and a Nintendo Wii. You can't do that. And so actually, either you raise like £3 million and build a purpose-built youth centre, or you go back to the drawing board and think, what is it about that thing that we want to do, and how can we do that with what we've got or what we don't have, and how can we get hold of something similar? We definitely got that vibe when we were meeting in the cafe. It felt like a nice place to be, and it changed the dynamic of our Friday nights because it was fun and it was exciting, and you had like that cafe feel, which felt a bit more kind of modern, and different young people came because of the
Mm.
purely because of the venue.
Yeah.
Uh,
I just wanted to mention as well that sometimes we think we need something that is like consistent, the same space, the same place every week or every other week or however often we're going to meet. Whereas I think sometimes we don't even necessarily need that. Like young people just need the consistency of knowing that it's going to be on, not necessarily where it's going to be. As long as you've got good communication with parents and young people, like it doesn't have to be the same place every time. So you could have so, if you can't get somewhere that's going to have you every week or every other week or however often you meet, you can find somewhere that will have you for 1 week and then you go somewhere else for the next and somewhere else for the next and have a bit of a rolling program. Sometimes stuff like that can work as well, really well.
I think, yeah, I think it can. I think you have to be, or ideally you have it on like the first week of the month is at this place,
Yeah.
purely for the people who fall out of the loop or aren't very good at accessing communication. And you only rock up to the wrong place once or twice before you think, oh no,
Yeah.
I can't keep track of this.
Yeah. I think youth works hard regardless of whether you've got a building or not. I think it obviously complicates it sometimes when we haven't got a building and we've got to think a bit more carefully about where we choose to meet and what it is that we choose to do. But I think it's like a lot of youth work anyway. For most of us, it's trial and error. So sometimes we might have to try a venue. If it doesn't work, we can try somewhere else. Like you don't have to if you're out there and you're trying somewhere and you're thinking it's really not working, don't feel like you've failed. We've got to pick ourselves up and just try a different venue if it's not working. And I think to remember, you're not on your own. If you're struggling with even thinking about venues, if you've got a team, have it as a team discussion, let people suggest different ideas, or just have a list of places that you're going to try, and try them out and see where works and see where doesn't and settle on somewhere that does. And that's okay.
Yeah, and for all we said about like planning and deciding what you want to do, what your aim is, and then shaping the building around that, it might be you're not aiming for perfection. It might be you try it and it doesn't work. It might be you try it and it doesn't work for a bit and you stick it out and then it does work. But I think that element of trial and error, if you go to a place and it's really not working, you don't have to be so attached to it that you don't feel like you can go anywhere else. I think there's a lot of wisdom in trying stuff and then trying other stuff.
Yeah, and maybe if you're renting somewhere, don't
If what
sign
you're
up
doing
for
is not
like a
working.
year or something. Just sign up, just try
Yeah.
it for a few weeks and see if it works before you sign any contracts that are like 12 months long or anything.
Yeah. Commit yourself to $5,000 for a venue for the
Yeah.
year.
But also, obviously, pray about it. Like, God sometimes gives us ideas of places we haven't thought of. Also, obviously, when we're thinking about what it is that we're going to do or what it is that God wants us to do, sometimes we can have that kind of divine moment where God gives us inspiration of what to do or where to go or who to ask. And so, prayer is really helpful, I think, in discerning anything to do with youth or kids' work.
So, what's been your best and worst venue for youth work that you've ever had?
The best, I think, probably. So I used to work at a purpose-built youth building. That was like a converted old chapel building. That was pretty sweet. So we had like a recording studio in there, and we had like different meeting rooms, and we had a couple bigger rooms downstairs and an office in there. And I'd say that was a pretty decent building because of the options of like some things we could do, with all the spaces. And we did cell groups, and each group had a little room, and had a big enough space to do like an after school club. And it didn't, because it was only used for youth stuff pretty much. We could leave stuff set up and didn't have to worry about bringing everything with us every time. And so it had a lot of pros going for it.
What about worst?
Worst, I think the only one that's coming up in my mind is the one where I used to have my youth group as a teenager. That little old chapel building where we were like in the our group met in the little room that used to be like the office in there, and it had like a little kitchen at one end of like a sink that didn't work and crusty old sofa and loads of mice underneath it. I think thinking about stuff that I've led, I don't think there's any venues that particularly haven't worked, but like there's some where I really haven't thought it through in advance. So like we've done a lot of kids and youth combined social stuff when we had like 10 youth, 10 kids, which doesn't sound like a lot until suddenly there's two of you and you've got them all at bowling and like you're losing kids all over the place and like you've lost track of so and so and like no one's seen them and suddenly you're like, this is a really like poor choice of venue. Why did we think this was going to be a good idea? So I think not necessarily a particular venue, but just like sometimes where I've led stuff and we just haven't thought it through in terms of like what might happen or like what might be the pros and the cons of that particular place where we're going to be hosting that.
My worst, I think, was in between lockdowns. You could wear a mask or you could be outdoors, and we opted for outdoors, and we bought everyone ponchos like really cheap, and it was driving rain, and we had to be like 2 meters apart from each other. It was so wet you couldn't have a fire. My church had vetoed the marquee I wanted to buy, so like, and that was totally bad planning on my part. I've been to a kids' work thing actually that was in a vestry, and they were expecting 2 young people, which would have been a squeeze in this tiny little vestry. And actually, I brought my daughter, and a load of other families brought surprise children. So they ended up with about 8 young people squashed into a like very, very, very small room with like a radiator that you couldn't touch at one end, and like that. But they made the best of it, and actually it was fine. Someone spilt a drink, and like it literally went over everyone because everyone was touching. A really great venue we had, which on the outside would have looked like a terrible venue, is a really generous lady in our church really wanted to host one of our youth groups, and she had a basement room like in her little house, and it was tiny, and it was fine because they started in year 7 and there were like 6 of them and they were quite small, but then they were through in there until they were like year 11, and they were massive by that point, and everyone was shoulder to shoulder, but they loved that basement. Like we'd try and like change location every so often, and they were like, no, we want to be in the basement. So actually, although it looked bad, it was one of the best, like part because the young people got so attached to it, and it showed that value to them.
Yeah, that's a really nice story. I think like we've got to say like do a risk assessment, haven't we, off the back of that about most of those poor and good options. We just think through what might be the risks in that place, especially thinking about the super hot radiator. Which reminds me, I was at a mum and baby thing the other week that was at a venue, and there was like they had those, you know, those heaters that got actual flames in them. As someone's baby was like crawling towards the flame, and I was like, oh man, like someone really hasn't risk assessed this venue for a mum and baby venue. Obviously don't want to harm or maim anybody's child.
Yeah, try and make sure it's safe.
Yeah. So I guess that ties it up pretty nicely.
Yeah.
Thank you to Dave for your submission for today's podcast theme. You have really inspired our conversation, so thank you for that. Hopefully some of our answers have inspired your work. And yeah, it's been great to have a chat about venues and youth and kids work and the challenges that are faced when you haven't got a building.
I just want to say we love hearing from you guys. So if anyone's got any other suggestions or for questions that would be useful or things you think would be helpful, please do get in touch with us. Thank you for listening to this one. It's been the Youth Work Plus podcast. If you've got a topic you want covered, or you want more information about what we've just been talking about, or something doesn't make sense, then you can email us at hello@youthworkplus.com. That's PLUS, not a plus symbol in plus. Check out our website, and there's loads of things on there to encourage you and equip you in your role with kids or youth, and you'll find recommended resources, map to ministry, merchandise, info about networks you can join, free advice, consultancy, opportunity to get in touch with any of us. There's loads on there, so go and have a look. And don't forget to subscribe and like, and tune in next time to our podcast. Thanks for listening. Yeah, and just remember, you're doing better than you think you are. Just keep going. It never looks good from the inside, but stuff often looks good from the outside. And people will talk about your youth work over the years, about things that you've forgotten happened or thought were a disaster. Yeah, and do get in touch with us. We love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for listening. I forgot to mention we've got 1,000 downloads for our podcast. So yes,
Yeah, I saw that.
thank
That's
you
cool.
to everybody who's been listening and downloading, and hopefully you've been finding this useful. But yeah, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.